Welcome everyone to this session. Welcome to this Magic and Ecology live panel on ancient magic and the non-human world. So now I turn to my speakers, Esther, Eidinow and Sophie Lunn-Rockliffe. Welcome to both of you, and thank you in particular for your fantastic presentations on YouTube. It strikes me that they were fantastically well balanced, partly because they were from different ends of antiquity, although some people would probably question the idea that Esther's was at the beginning of antiquity, but from my point of view, it's at one end of antiquity at least, and both incredibly rich in concrete examples, but at the same time also quite varying insofar as Sophie's was focused very much on the natural world in these kind of gorgeous small samples, as it were, of the dirt from under your sandals. It's very, very specific, whereas Esther, your presentation was much more focused on a kind of wider snapshot of the environment. So thank you both of you for giving us that rich feast. Could I start by asking each of you in turn to just say a few words about your presentation, but also perhaps commenting a little bit on what you see to be the continuities and the differences between the different worlds you've animated for us. I suppose I should start with Esther and then move on to Sophie, but maybe that's I'm caricaturing you by following chronological order. Esther.
Okay, Tom, thank you very much for that, and thank you also to Simone, I should say, for inviting me to this. Okay, so I want to say how much I enjoyed Sophie's presentation as well before I kick off, and I can see quite a lot of interesting points of commonality and sort of branching points as well, which is fun. But you want me to say a few things about what I talked about. So Simone asked us to explore the relationship between place and power and bodies in ancient magic, and she wanted to us to think a little bit about how specific landscapes embody spiritual beings, or at least that was the question that she asked that I picked up on, and that made me think very specifically about the ways in which ancient Greek landscapes were understood to comprise supernatural entities or beings, and then the ways in which communities and individuals formed relationships with those beings. And nowadays, that kind of closeness to nature is one of the aspects, as I understand it, of modern magic, or at least parts of modern magic, because obviously that's a huge and varied field. But when we examine those phenomena in ancient Greece, they're usually grouped under the category of religion. And of course, there's a recapturing of pre-Christian religion that's part of some modern magical practice, but it prompted me to think a bit about the relevance and the development of that categorization in the ancient world. Before then, following the flow of the paper, coming back to think about the communities and particularly the individuals who formed these very special relationships with those nymphs who encapsulate that relationship to the landscape. So that's sort of what I guess I would say my paper was about. Do you want us to comment on similarities at this point, or kind of connections? Would that be?
Yes. Do you want to start with that now, Esther?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just highlight a few things, and I'm sure Sophie will highlight a lot more, but we've talked about definitions, or we've sort of moved around the area of definition, and that's quite an interesting area that we have both alluded to. I talk about it much more explicitly, but certainly Sophie was alluding to it. And I was also interested in thinking about the power of the inanimate and how that is portrayed. So where it gets its power from, what makes it authoritative, or to have some kind of something that we want, and then how that relationship is built with the inanimate object in order to create that relationship. And that seemed to me something that was reflecting across these different papers in different ways, but underlying it, that question of power was really redolent for me. So I'll stop there.
Esther, thank you. Sophie, over to you.
Great. I mean, actually, the power of inanimate objects. So this is the thing that's been exercising me, which is what happens, and I'm not the first person to think this thought, I'm coasting on this, tailwinds of great scholars like Geoffrey Jerome Cohen. How does it change our world if we think that stones might be alive? And I suppose the thing that strikes me when I read any kind of late antique text, whether it's a magical papyrus or a life of a saint, is that once you start looking for it, not universally and not to the same degree, but this is something that actually does animate a lot of the world in which these people live, is a conception that animals and plants sure are alive and organic and animate, but also things that seem quite surprising, minerals and rocks and gems. And there's been quite a lot of really interesting work looking at kind of case studies of particular categories of sort of remarkable things that have particular properties that are conceived of as having their own lives. And I thought, well, what happens if you look at the stuff that's sort of everywhere and nowhere, and that is sort of beyond comment or is so sort of ordinary as not to be important? And I coupled that with thinking, I'm very interested in demons. That's the subject matter of my research at the moment. And I thought I'd go looking, given Simone's prompts about landscape, not necessarily thinking topographically about mountains and springs and caves, but about actually, grains of earth, sand and dirt, and see whether there was a connection. And I had no idea before I started. And it's quite interesting because there is quite a lot there, but it's not a kind of overwhelming body of material. You have to kind of sift and trawl a little bit. But what seems to emerge from that is something which, again, I'm not the first to notice, is the idea that there is a kind of essential porosity between the beings that flit around the earth that are not human, that are not animal, that are daimonic and have bodies but very thinly sort of wispily embodied bodies that are hard to see, and the very earthy, concrete, mattery stuff of the earth. And that's something that you see particularly in the magical materials, which is sort of where I started. But then if you think about the kind of the way in which Earth might communicate something between different regions, you also see it in the relationship between saints and the other needy humans that seek their help. So, I mean, slightly spuriously putting those two things together, but thinking that they actually take place in the same landscape. So I focused on ancient Egypt because we have this huge wealth of material, both papyrological and sort of early Christian hagiography and historical writing. And what emerged from that was something which I thought sort of hung together in terms of thinking about the agency of dirt, and it works in different ways. And I suppose various connections with Esther's presentation and research come to mind. And one of them is actually to do with this question about relationship between the particular sort of spiritual being and a landscape, which was a question I had for Esther, really, which is more about the coming to be of nymphs, because my demons, there are all sorts of backstories about how a demon becomes a demon, and the question of how they acquire a relationship with matter is fleshed out differently by different thinkers. But how do your nymphs become nymphs? And what's the relationship between, I mean, the honest truth is, the thing that comes to mind here is a running theme in the film Moana, which I have been watching with my toddlers, in which the heroine basically comes to realise that one of the islands in her landscape is actually a volcanic island, is actually a god. It's a powerful female goddess, and it's her ability to communicate and in fact placate this entire land formation that is the sort of climax of the film. And I'm sorry to give away for those of you who haven't seen it. And it makes me think of Niobe. And so the question about, are nymphs things that inhabit a landscape, or are they things that actually are more concretely in themselves some form of landscape? So they're crossing boundaries between being people, spiritual beings, trees, mountains. So I just wanted to know more about the relationship and the kind of question about transformational porosity, about communication. And that was my sort of, I've got lots of other questions for you too, but that was one of my first ones.
Shall we start with that then? Esther, how does a nymph become a nymph?
How does a nymph become a nymph? I think this is a particularly lovely question because it alludes to this blurring of boundaries that there is, I think, between landscape and imagined body or personification of that landscape. So I don't think, I mean, certainly they are depicted for the most part as young women, and that's how they are imagined and personified, and that cult takes place. So we see them depicted in that way visually. Sorry, I've got distracted by the chat. I'm not very good at this. Right. We see them depicted in this way in material culture. So in material evidence, we hear them talked about in this way. But certainly their bodies are doing things that are unlike human bodies. I think they live for a long time. Various different bits of evidence give you different insights into the longevity of their lives and whether or not they can perish. But there is a sense in which they are both the landscape and personifying the landscape and are separate from the landscape. And I think there's a kind of spectrum of ways in which they exist like that. So there isn't a sort of very easy answer to that idea of, you know, what is it, where does it come from? Which I think is very important, actually, because there is something about them being in those places for particular reasons. I mean, they can also come to be in specific spaces. So you will get young women who become springs or become parts of the landscape. Sometimes those start off as nymphs, sometimes they end up as nymphs, but you've got a sense of them in some way. They come to inhabit that space, so they come to inhabit the landscape in that way. I don't know if that was supremely incoherent, as blurred as the subject matter that I'm trying to talk about. Did that make any sense?
It did. And I mean, I wonder whether I may just have a weirdly sort of, I may be just thinking Ovid and Metamorphoses and Roman stuff, and I may be just trapped in a kind of later view of the, because I don't know the early material. And so it may be partly when you say dryads, I'm thinking of, you know, sort of Renaissance statues of women sort of half mid-transformation, that sort of thing. And I think that's probably,
yeah,
at which point the anachronism was introduced about this motif of transformation, but I think it's probably a lot later.
No, I think that's absolutely fine. You do get, I mean, as I said, you do get particular women who then become, you know, they're chased by a god and they then become a part of the landscape, and they then may become a nymph. But that certainly isn't all of them that start off like that, because you certainly have, for example, images of Persephone when she's dancing in her, before she gets swept off by Hades and she's dancing in her meadow. She's surrounded by nymphs. They are not necessarily going to be, you know, they're not mortal women who have become, you know, we have no backstory for that. And certainly one of them, I think, is meant to be Tukia, who is chance. So she's a personification of an abstract value. So there's lots of, what I was trying to allude to was that there's lots of different ways in which you are going to find these creatures coming into the landscape. Some of them may have been mortal, not all of them. Certainly not all of them are going to be have the backstories that, for example, Arethusa has. Oh, she's meant to be a huntress, but is she a huntress who's actually in some way already supernatural in some way? Possibly. So there's all, you know, there's lots of different ways in which they are conveyed. If she's leaping around in the landscape already as a huntress, then there's something already slightly, what's the word I'm looking for? Slightly wild about her already in that sense. So something slightly untamed, and is that already that she is already in it? Well, perhaps, you know, that. So there's all of these pieces that come together to make it. But I mean, the word nymph is a very rich one, and it certainly starts to be, I mean, you get the overlap between nymphs and heroines that Jennifer Larson has talked so beautifully about. So you do find that in this world, that word can also be used to allude to supernatural female figures, which we're not pinning down to any specific entity. So it's not that, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not that defined.
It's fascinating in itself, though, isn't it? The idea that there's a category which is so broad that it isn't a category. I mean, I'm just trying to think whether there are other supernatural beings that one could think of as kind of crossing as many different boundaries in terms of etiology, ontology, you know.
Well, you can think about heroes. I mean, hero cult is a very interesting one as well in that sense. I mean, it's heroes who cross over into the boundaries of being gods, like the Dioscoroi or Heracles, who is both god and hero and mythical figure. So I think that blurring of boundaries is not, it's something that occurs in this world.
And there's a continuity here with I mean, gods and other more kind of traditional agents. I mean, there's a continuity between these questions and the questions of whether you know, Zeus X is the same as Zeus Y, or
Exactly.
Zeus is the same as Ammon, and so on. It's part of the same overarching kind of fluidity, I would have thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose actually my demons, I mean, some of them are, it's clear, ghosts of the restless dead, and others are, you know, fallen angels. And I mean, there is a similar, I mean, in a sense, it tells you something about the diversity, I suppose, of cultures and local, sensibilities.
I should just say at this moment that to everyone else listening that we're open for business in terms of questions and answers as well. I have various questions, and I know that Sophie and Esther could ask questions of each other. There is a question that has just arrived, or an observation. I haven't yet read it. Thank you for your fascinating interpretation of being taken by nymphs. Would you say that one might see this as a special form of openness and receptivity to the non-human creaturely world expressed as communication with non-human spirit worlds? That's really for you, Esther.
Yes, I think you could see it like that. And I love this idea of being taken by the nymphs. I think you see it used in a variety of different ways. So there are the nympholeps that we see who are involved in this very close relationship with some kind of non-human entity, of the three that I described in the presentation. But you also see this phrase, I think, of people who have disappeared, in the landscape. And so there's this idea that they've literally been kidnapped. I don't want to use that word because it's too strong, but they've somehow disappeared into the landscape, never to be seen again. It's used in that sense as well. So let's focus on the communication with non-human spirit world side of it, which I think is about receptivity, partly because I think it also leads into prophetic power and poetic power. And so there's an idea that you are having some kind of relationship with those powers that are beyond human, that allow you to see and speak in ways that are inspired by what is not human. And so, yes, I think it is specifically about, I like this idea of it being about communication, but it's communication that sort of goes both ways in that sense.
And I would actually want to dive into that because I was fascinated by, I mean, both the kind of lexis of nympholepsy but also what it implies about displacement of agency or personality. So again, in my sort of sphere of thinking about daimonic possession, particularly in the kind of Christian description of it, it's a much more displacing activity. So once you've got a demon inside you, your own voice and agency is invisible and kind of suspended, such that, you know, women who are possessed by male demons speak with a male voice. They can often speak different languages. They're not really legally or morally responsible for the things they do while they're possessed, because
are they not?
No.
Oh,
well, the legal thing is that's loose. But certainly in terms of the kind of anecdotal, there's definitely a sense that when you're possessed by a demon, you're sort of not there, and the terrible things that you do are really the demon doing it through you, which means that when you're exorcised,
Yeah.
You kind of are, I mean, the Peter Brown line is that you're kind of restored to the community as a social agent and sort of forgiven because it wasn't really your fault. But it's a very kind of moralizing take on possession. But what I was interested in is this notion of whether it's to do with inspiration or kidnapping. It's more of a nymph and a person in a relationship rather than one thing coming inside and displacing the other.
Well, difficult. Again, here we go with the, fluid Greek lines as understood by modern scholars, so possibly much better understood by actual contemporary ancient Greeks. But here's my attempt. Is that okay? So as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the Pythia, where the possession is, full on, 100% possession, speaking with the voice of Apollo, and that's very similar, I think, or much more similar to what you were talking about. With we also have sort of a little bit of information around demonic possession in the sense of the belly talkers. I can't remember the name of is it Euclides, who is the demon who possesses through the belly. And there's a variety of ways in which that's alluded to, but the Aristophanes talks a little bit or alludes to it about being possessed. But there's a way in which we also have belly talkers who have some kind of presence within them, that they are also prophets in that sense, mantes in that sense, and they're giving their responses by something that is inside their body, and that's much more physically inside because you can hear it speaking from within. But then the nympholepts, it's not, I mean, partly because we have such slightly sketchy evidence in the sense of not really being able to have descriptions of what it is that they look like when they are taken. But we know that they are understood to speak prophetically. So perhaps they do look possessed in that sense when they are possessed, but we don't have a description of that. And of the ones who are writing about themselves being possessed, it isn't clear to what level, on what, if you think of possession as a spectrum, are they wholly taken by the nymph? I mean, I don't get that impression from Archidamus, for example, because he draws the nymph and he draws Archidamus separately. So he actually doesn't draw himself as the nymph, if you see what I mean. He draws the two of them together. So I don't know, can I draw that out? I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, the same with the little pictures of the, if that is Onesimus on the little pots from Capheton in Cyprus. He's not looking particularly nymphy. He's looking bearded. He's not portraying himself as possessed. And there potentially would have been ways. I mean, if you think about Niobe being slowly turned to stone, perhaps there would have been ways of portraying yourself as somehow possessed. I don't know. I mean, that's quite an interesting thing to think about. But in that sense, if there's a spectrum of possession, I don't think that we have them completely taken physically and bodily, but it depends on how you would understand a poet to perform. To what extent is that a physically embodied performance where I am taken by the nymphs and I speak?
There are a couple of questions queuing up, but can I follow up from what you just said, Esther, a little bit? One of the passages in Sophie's paper that I was really interested in was the bit about the holy men animating the dirt, and as it were, there's the way in which there's a level at which the dirt is always animated, but at the same time it needs to be kind of recharged, as it were, like a kind of dodgy phone battery, periodically in order to have more potency. And I wondered, moving across to your nymphs, whether, and when Archidamus describes himself as captured by the nymphs, it sounds like it's a constant state. But is it a constant state, but one that gets kind of as it were, intensified, or is it an even thing? It sounds much more like a kind of legal status in the case of Archidamus. Not.
That's quite fun. I quite like that. I mean, well, I was thinking about Tommy frozen. Have I frozen?
No, I can hear you.
Okay, all right, because I can never tell if somebody else is frozen, if it's actually you.
You're still
I
live.
think it's quite nice. Tom, are you there? Oh,
You may have to log out and come back.
yeah. I'm quite interested by this idea of it being a legal status, just because somebody's taken a piece of land and worked on it. But I don't know that there's any evidence for that to occur.
I mean, actually, I was thinking when you were talking about possession, I was actually thinking that if one looks to something like classical tragedy and, you know, Pericles sort of seized by kind of diamond. I mean, there is a kind of comparable tradition, of course, in the kind of classical Greek canon for people being taken over doing terrible things and then kind of returning to themselves. So it's not exactly a kind of Christian.
Absolutely. I mean, there's Arter, right? And Agamemnon being seized by Arter and using it as an excuse. And it's Arter, you know, Arter, Tuchia, Nymph. There's something very porous about, you know, that range of beings that we can't control, that come and control us. I think, yeah, absolutely.
I also wonder whether there's not a gender angle to all of this. I mean, might it not be?
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because I was interested in Athanasius's old women and their doing things to people, and whether that sort of diatribe is always against women in that way. I mean, there are male magicians in this way, aren't there? Quite famous ones.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you would just talk a little bit about that, because it seemed yes, that gender angle came in very strongly there.
Yeah, there's a whole, basically the kind of Christian discourse against magic, let's use the word because they use all the kind of terms they can find, is often, I mean, both Athanasius and John Chrysostom, who write a lot about the fact that all of their congregations are taking refuge in spells and charms and potions and amulets, which tells us, of course, that that's what people were doing, which is quite interesting. Even though they're being told not to, the fact that they're being told not to so regularly means it must have been quite a commonplace. And it's often heavily gendered and also ageist as well. There's not just women, the old women, and described in very pejorative terms, kind of old hags. You know, there's a kind of witch, you know, it's a very early trope of the witch kind of, and also being criticised for, you know, overcharging her clients. So there's a whole kind of nexus of economic and sort of gender and ageist critique going on there. But it's interesting because the evidence for what sort of scribes were preparing amulets in the Christian world, there's not very much evidence for, well, it's hard to know, but you know, from what we know about the kinds of Christians who would have been able to write in this period, it's mostly monastic. Probably mostly male, but there might well have been female scribes as well. So it's hard to match up with a kind of material record to get a good sense of how far this is the kind of invented spectre of, you know, the other, and how the kind of a genuine social phenomenon. But it's true that it is, you're absolutely right, it's heavily gendered.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I was thinking about the genders of the landscape as well. I mean, just from my point of view, your rivers are male and your nymphs are female. And I was wondering if gender actually features in your, I mean, the material quality, the dust, obviously of relics or contact with relics. But does your material object become gendered in that way at all? Or is it inanimate and neuter? And
that's a great question. Do you know, I need to go away and check that, and a lot of it depends on what language, what vocabulary is being used, and in what language. So there are some terms, and this is where my shaky linguistic, I'm just trying to remember whether the Coptic terms are masculine or feminine. I actually can't remember. I need to go and check. There could be something very interesting there to look comparative. And again, with the Syriac material, because sometimes you do find interesting contrasts where in one linguistic tradition, something is very definitively male, whereas in another it's definitively female.
It's really interesting.
There's lots of questions in the chat. Shall we take some of those?
Yes, let's do that. What's the name reference to the belly demon? I will get that reference for you and pop it in the chat while we're talking, and or perhaps afterwards. I don't know if there's a way of I could do it now, but that won't be a very interesting thing to watch me get the reference for you. So
let's talk about those places, and we can do you know, you can talk a bit, and then while I'm talking, you can
go and look for the reference. So if nymphs only inhabit wild places, what do wild mean? Oh, well, big question. Did they inhabit only wild places? No, you have nymphs of cities. So that's not the case. But your ideal place where a nymph is going to be found, it's less so much that it's wild, it's more that it's welcoming. So there's something there that is powerful in the sense of it, and I gave a few examples of that sense of it being an idyllic space, a space that has water and shade, and so welcomes you in, and during that the harsh summer sun. So it actually is a place that just the emphasis on wild is possibly less important, but what you're dealing with, I don't want to get too structuralist here, is a little bit of the sort of city, not city. But again, those boundaries that we perhaps see drawn boldly and also theoretically were perhaps not so theoretical for Greeks who are moving between their pieces of land outside the city or across a particular area, moving between different land holdings that they had. So wild is an interesting question, and we use it. We should use it more carefully. I think Patricia is right. If that's sort of where you were going with that, Patricia. I don't know. Do you? Thank you. No, thank you.
I would actually follow up on that, because I'm interested in the connection between demons and desert spaces. So there's a lot of stuff in particularly the Greek and Latin sort of Christian text that talks about demons belonging particularly in the landscape, which is eremos, and it's not desert as in hot, sandy, it's desert as in a place which is empty, but it's actually not necessarily a place that's always been empty and wild and uncultivated. It's often somewhere that's been abandoned, so it has a kind of melancholy to it, I suppose. But also, yeah, that a lot of what's going on is in a sense where they're not. So it's not just that they're particularly drawn to those places, but that they don't like other sorts of places. But it's real in the sense that it has quite an important consequence in the kind of history of early Christianity, which is that very zealous ascetics, people who are sort of giving up a worldly life, actually choose to move to marginal locations in wherever they're living, whether it's, the forests of Gaul or the sands of Egypt. They choose to go to places where humans aren't in order to kind of seek out demons to fight with them. So it's not just a sort of passing scholarly sort of self-indulgence to say, oh yes, well, you often find demons in these particular places. It's something that you actually find written into the experiences and the lives of the kind of, particularly the sort of super zealous, the people who want to go out and do battle with demons. It's also quite ironic because actually there are plenty of demons that hang out in the cities as well. Places like bathhouses and theatres are thought to be peculiarly attractive to demons. But nonetheless, if you want to kind of do hand-to-hand combat with them, then the best place to do that is in an abandoned fort or in a cell in the middle of the desert.
Thank you, both of you. I'm now animate again, I hope. I hope you can see me. Unfortunately, only after I've been thrown out and all the questions have been wiped, but I'm guessing that you've, I know I can see from the chat that Esther's answered the question from Anjali about belly talking. And I think you've also worked through Patricia's question. I think there was one other question which I can't see any longer because it's been wiped from my chat. Have you also
about ghosts and spirits?
Yes. I'm afraid I can't see that. So if one of you could possibly read it or represent it in summary form, that would be great.
Can you see it, Esther? We can no longer hear you.
Yeah, I know. I've unmuted myself and now I will try again. Any comment about the role of ghosts or spirits in ancient Greece?
Thank you very much, Esther.
There's more. Supposedly in Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, ghosts 8th century BC, they weren't feared, but by the 5th century BC, they were made into frightening creatures.
There's amazing, the wonderful book by Sarah Miles Johnson on The Restless Dead is a cheat to sort of recommend go and read a book, but I think what she has to say on the topic is pretty amazing.
Yeah, I'm not sure that your ghosts aren't feared. earlier than that. Really.
Yeah, Nicaea is a kind of terrifying encounter, isn't it? Really.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what I'm just wondering about. I mean, certainly by the 5th century. I mean, you've certainly got them. Well, it's interesting that because curse tablets, you don't have them really turning up as the restless dead until you can watch them actually developing, because to begin with, they're just corpses and they're used as analogies for death. And I mean, they're not used as analogies for death. They are the analogy. They are death, and they are used as the analogies for being still and useless. Thank you. Every Thursday night, ladies and gentlemen. But they're used as they're used for being useless. You know, so you're like a dead body, and it's only then that they are called on as witnesses, and then as that gradually, I mean, it isn't really a spectrum because these texts are hard to date, but you can certainly see the development into the unquiet dead, where they're called on in order to actually attack other people. And that's a process that gradually happens. And certainly when Odysseus is down in book 11, I mean, the reason I was pausing was because some of those ghosts aren't frightening, but that's because Odysseus knows them and talks to them. And he's certainly terrified when they're all coming up out of the trench, you know, and he keeps his sword to keep them away from him. And they're there to because they're attracted by the blood. So I'm not sure that they're not scary. In fact, that scene is really chilling.
And I think there are some of the later ghosts who are very definitely not scary. Like, for example, Periander's wife, Melissa,
Yeah.
who is literally restless because of not of how she's been treated, but there's no obvious sign of anger at any rate.
Yeah.
So I think it's more.
Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, Esther. You go first.
You start.
Just more ambivalent, I think, in both ends of the spectrum chronologically. Now I think I've now caught up with the chat, but I'm not absolutely sure. So do feel free to throw some more things in. If there's no one immediately there, I could throw a question back to Sophie and Esther. I mean, I think it might be useful for people who aren't specialists in antiquity, in particular, to delve a little bit more into the magic religion debate. I mean, Esther, you articulated it very, very clearly, it seems to me, and exactly what I agree with everything you said in relation to our end of antiquity, as it were. Sophie, you had some wonderfully poised moments in your presentation where you said things like what scholars tend to call ritual, I've forgotten now the phrases, texts of ritual power and ritual practice, not referring to it as magic. So I suppose I just wanted to ask, if you like, how the debate looks from your end, as it were. Obviously, magical papyri are called magical papyri, but that's a kind of slightly traditional nomenclature. Does it look very similar to the way in which Esther characterised it?
I mean, I think the great difference, actually, Esther's given me a fantastic setup, is that when you're dealing with the world of the kind of 4th century CE onwards, and a kind of post-Constantinian era where emperors are Christian, the aristocracy is piecemeal and sort of higgledy-piggledy converting to Christianity, and the empire is changing, if you like, its kind of religious identity slowly and far from inexorably, but nonetheless there's a big sort of watershed moment. And one of the things you see from the sort of early 4th century onwards is a growing self-confidence on the part of the institutional church in basically sort of erecting the bogeyman of magic, which has of course been around for a long time, and it's not that the Christians have invented it, and there is, you know, a Roman invective against magic, and there are Jewish invectives against magic. So it's not that they're inventing it, but it becomes something that's much more visible, something that's being preached from pulpits, something that's being inculcated in converts to Christianity. There's all these practices that you must not indulge in. And actually, Tom, while you were away, we were talking a little bit about the kind of Christian invective against sort of witchy hags selling amulets for inflated prices, which is something that emerges from things like sermons. And the fact that there's so much of this stuff suggests that in reality, the congregations of Christians who are actually showing up to church now and again are probably continuing to engage in these sorts of things. So that basically the kind of the rhetoric and the discourse coming from the kind of bishops and emperors is divisive, and it's about erecting boundaries and making a sort of fairly hard-edged category of magic, which is bad. But the reality, the social reality, is that people are continuing to do these things. And actually, there's an amazing new book, which I'll put in chat, by a Canadian scholar called Theo de Bruyn, called Making Amulets Christian. And he has done some fantastic papyrological work showing, using just some really sort of lovely tools, including looking at sort of scribal habits and so on, to prove, I think, beyond doubt that there are lots of amulets being written, so, you know, little charms and spells against disease or in favor of love and friendship and business, which are actually being prepared by a circle of people who we have to put in the cadre of Christian priests and monks. So at the same time as you have bishops standing up in church saying, don't commission magic, don't wear amulets, don't rely on, I mean, I gave a little passage from Athanasius' text, you know, don't rely on, you know, strange sort of spells and hocus pocus, that actually this stuff is not only continuing to be sort of performed and used by large portions of the population, but it's also something that Christian clerics and monks are themselves involved in preparing. And so the reality is, I think, a lot more, I mean, it depends what kind of words you're happy with, whether you want to think of syncretism or whether you want to think of having your cake and eating it. But that would be my, so the major historical difference is the context in which you do now have something which looks a bit more like a centralized institutional structure.
Thank you very much. A follow-on question on that from Paul Johnston, a question for Sophie: how would you define magic? No easy question to throw at you. And would you make a connection with consciousness and imagination?
Well, that's a fantastic question. Gosh, I feel so ill-qualified to speculate other than by taking refuge in the words of others. I mean, I suppose, but because I'm a historian, the way that I think about this is how do people in antiquity think about magic? And I suppose I would then actually connect back with some of the things that Esther said, which is that a lot of the vocabulary of magic is in Latin and Greek and beyond is very specific, and oddly often involves a kind of location of magic somewhere which is other than where you are, so that, you know, the language of magic is something that associates it with Persia, or associates it, if you're in Egypt, associates it very strongly with Jews. So magic in antiquity, as if one's coming up with a kind of a neat little package to describe what it is as a phenomenon, is necessarily going to be an outsider's definition. It's going to be a kind of, you know, an etic circumlocution of the kind that I, you know, slightly unfairly derided by, you know, activities of, ritual, you know, the trying to, I mean, a kind of a realm of engaging in acts of ritual power. The question of their relationship with consciousness and imagination. I mean, I feel like this is the sort of thing where what I really want is somebody who knows about the practice of magic from the inside to look at my texts and my objects and tell me what they see. There's not something I can do because I don't have that insight. So that's a bit of a dodge. But
perhaps we could invite others to come in and say how comparable it is to definitions or kind of bundles of magic in other contexts. On that topic, in fact, there's a comment from YouTube. Le Nain Rouge of Detroit, Michigan, USA comes to mind as a city demon type of entity. I must admit, I'm completely ignorant here, and we might need more explanation in the chat about the nature of this demon type of entity. Maybe Sophie knows.
No, never heard of it. I'd like to know more. So
please do come back, Terry from YouTube.
One thing actually that occurs to me that might be a little bit more giving than what I've just sort of dodged. Consciousness and imagination. And one of the things that's very striking about the magical papyri is the question of who is doing what to whom. It's a sort of grammatical kicking question, but it actually comes into thinking about the relationship between, again, what scholars would call practitioners of, well, magic, ritual practitioners, ritual experts, sages, and their clients. And the reason I say that is there's some really interesting slippages where you'll find a text, a spell in which the first person speaker of the ritual expert gets absorbed into some other persona, be it a divinity or indeed a historical famous magician, be it Solomon or Hipparchus or one of the great sort of Egyptian magicians. And so there are interesting questions in my mind about how far, if one's thinking about this as being a kind of world of esoteric knowledge, and that having access to that knowledge gives you power, that it then does some very interesting things in terms of kind of voice and agency, and that actually perhaps there is something going on about the individual practitioner becoming absorbed into a kind of, you know, I mean, a sort of invisible population of magicians past, present and future. Of course, there's theatrical as well about it. There's lots of different ways of reading that. But in terms of thinking about consciousness, there does seem to be some interesting forms of identification that you get in those texts. It might be one way of looking at it.
A follow on from Simone, I'm struck by Stephen Skinner's definition of magic in antiquity as the art of affecting the world through interaction with spirits. Skinner is also a magical practitioner, and he's interested in the way in which magic in the ancient world is not centered around human agency, but rather around non-human agency. So it fits in very well with both your talks. And then Dave, sorry, I just to throw in at the same time, David says, personally, I define it as something that gives an illusion towards that what doesn't happen in a physical sense. I think it's a what not of that. This I come up having observed pagan Wicca rituals.
I mean, I think there's also because there's the world through interaction with spirits is a really nice idea, but overlapping also with what Sophie was saying about the different voices of historical, if you like, other authorities of knowledge. And I think authority is a really big term or an important term that needs to come into that as well, because some of that allusion to other figures. I mean, I'm just also thinking about sort of the Sortes Estramsiki, which in some eyes is a magical text. It's a divinatory text, but it's written in the voice of an Egyptian magician, and it's again this idea, I think, also that this knowledge is knowledge that is handed down. And so it's something that you learn, and you see that literally in the accounts of people who acquire magical books or acquire magical paraphernalia. And we hear about those often actually uncomfortably in legal trials, but we hear about them inheriting this stuff and then using it in ways that the orator wants to portray in some slightly dodgy sense. But we also see it in stories, for example, in Herodotus, where you're talking about people who have inherited divinatory gifts or come from a particular part of Greece that is famous for its seers and its, you know, its mantes and the people who practice in a particular way. So this one thing I think that I'm trying to get to is that it isn't this realm of knowledge and this realm of people that are being called on is both human and non-human, and importantly imagined and yet real. And it doesn't matter in some ways if they're imagined, because they represent an authority that in some ways could have existed and should have existed and probably did exist, because that information has some kind of a legacy that is imagined. And it's human and non-human. So the agency is mixed in that sense. So these are what Simone was talking about in terms of interaction with spirits. Those spirits are not necessarily spirits of the landscape. They may be spirits of people who lived before, or fictional spirits. And in some ways that doesn't matter. They have authority and they give it to you to practice.
Yeah, I mean, actually, two things struck me there. This kind of theme of inheritance is so interesting. I love the idea that, in a sense, if you've got the texts, then you can kind of do the work, as if that's enough, rather than the need for being instructed in how to use them. So there's interesting questions about, is the book itself is the thing, because that's what's suggested, is it not, by this kind of notion? And of course, so the idea of inheritance, I mean, one of the sort of current, I think, pretty well established sort of wisdoms among scholars of late antique Egypt is that the people in late antiquity who were traveling around Egypt, collecting spells, compiling magical handbooks, and also probably dispensing amulets and the like for a fee in the local marketplace, are probably descendants of the Egyptian temple priestly hierarchy. So it's again something you've kind of, you know, you're born into it basically, and that's what you kind of, what you have as your trade. So there's some quite interesting kind of cross-cultural things there. But I was also thinking about the sort of non-human agency. I mean, what's very striking if you look at magical papyri is that most of what you're dealing with is not actually people. It's either demons or chthonic deities of various kinds, and of course, you know, a sort of comprehensive mastery of matter. And from the kind of average cheap stuff that you can find on the sole of your sandal, but also lots of exotic ingredients. And if you just sort of scroll through Betts's translation of the Magical Papyri, it's unbelievable the kind of, it always makes me wonder, like if you go to the Cambridge marketplace in non-COVID times and there's some interesting stalls where there are lots of little sort of bottled bits of things, you know, how much of this stuff could you actually get? So it looks exotic on the page, but actually if you go to a sort of medium-sized town, you could probably get a vial of that for a small fee. So it's kind of hard for us to assess, I think, some of these things, but nonetheless, it's more about stuff than it is even really about demons, because if you're wanting to summon the demons, you need to make sure that you've got the recipe right first. So the description of these spell books in late antiquity as being cookbooks seems to me a very good, even though it's sort of anachronistic and makes you think of Nigella Dawson, it's quite helpful in some ways because it gets at something, at the importance of having a mastery, if you like, of the not just the non-human, but the organic, but sort of petrified or pickled world.
Can I follow up on that and on the idea of inheritance? I mean, I wonder whether the how much there are signs in your evidence of attempts to maintain the authority of the individual practitioner. So, for example, Sophie. I mean, in Esther's context, there are instances of people kind of taking bits out of each other in terms of their whether they've got authoritative status or whether they haven't. As she said, magic is the accusation you make about somebody else. In your context, Sophie, your fantastic text, your recipe text, with the tears of baboons and crocodile dung, where then those are explained. I mean, on the one hand, you could look at it from one perspective and say that actually these things which are being marked out as special aren't actually special at all, but then their justification somehow makes out, we couldn't tell everybody the truth because otherwise they would get involved in these dangerous practices they don't know how to. So when you could sort of see beneath the surface there, both the attempt to kind of pump themselves up by using very, very rare objects, which is clearly presumably the point behind the or a point behind the selection of items, and at the same time a kind of critique implicit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does completely. I mean, it seems like a strange kind of unveiling of something pretty important. I mean, so I'm just double checking, and it's part of a bigger papyrus, which is, a cookbook with lots of bits of, formulaic magic. And I'm just trying to find the particular, to see sometimes the order in which it occurs gives you a clue as to what's going on. Lots of charms for sending dreams and divination, mostly revelation forms of dreams. And then this one comes, seems like a sort of bit of, kind of removing the veil actually of how you've been sold a sort of a dummy, because actually the thing that you're paying for is perhaps less expensive than the thing it really is. And there's of course a fascinating thing about the way in which there's a kind of literate exclusion of the masses, because these things have been inscribed in a way that makes them, those who can read know and those who can't. But then to have it in a Greek papyrus written in Greek is kind of lifting the veil. So, I mean, obviously, if this is a cookbook that's being used by an itinerant magician, then presumably it's quite helpful to have the translation. And it goes on for, a good 10, 20, sort of 35 lines. And I mean, it really is they're all pretty banal. And a lot of it is, it's not quite Marks and Spencer's. but you know, wild lettuce, chamomile, wild garlic, piglet's milk. I mean, it's a bit
Lots
more
of magic. This is M&S magic.
Yeah. I think it's more yeah, it's more health food shop than it is supermarket store, but it's definitely accessible.
Okay, thank you. That's fantastic. There are some wonderful bits and pieces coming in the chat. So Terry came back about the Detroit, Michigan demon.
Oh, yeah.
So it seems to have appeared the first time in 1701 when Cadillac invaded Cadillac, and has continued to be reported to have been seen before major disasters, the Great Fire, the Rebellion of 1968, and so forth. It's also called the Demon of the Strait of Detroit. I wondered if this was the type of entity you were referring to as being in cities.
I mean, actually, it's not, but I need to read up on that, because I mean, the thing that comes to mind is the figure of in late antiquity of the Alastor, of the kind of avenging fury, the headless demon that seems stalking the streets of a city like Antioch before some major disaster takes place. And you find that not just in Christian writers, but actually in Ammianus, I think, talks about, I can't remember which instance it is, but there's certainly an account somewhere in Ammianus of a headless demon seen stalking the city walls of the city before something terrible happens. So that fascinating idea that there's, I mean, the question about the relationship is interesting. Is it acting as a kind of prophetic warning? Is it a way of indicating some breakdown in relationship with the divine? I mean, it raises more, because I don't know about the phenomenon, it raises more questions than I can answer, but absolutely comparable with some things that I can think of in antiquity.
Esther, do you want to respond on that? We've got a couple of other very juicy questions following on, but Esther, do you want to?
I was just actually wondering about the golem. And whether I mean, the golem defends, doesn't it? It was originally created to defend. So it actually comes in, and I was just thinking, because I was just googling because it's apparently a little red dwarf, the Nain Rouge it's called. I just the power of being online while you're in a meeting, it's fabulous. But there's that idea of something very small that comes into a city. Is it there to presage disaster? Is it there because disaster's coming and it's coming to defend? That would be a really interesting question. I mean, it just sort of makes me think, I mean, around cities, it makes me think about the Chichair of cities, who's there to defend, to look after. This is the spirit of the city in some way. That is the sort of the uncertainty, the fortune of the city. Is it but they're usually sort of statuesque women in some way, and quite large. I mean, in the sense of human-sized or more. But you're not thinking about to think of the Nain Rouge is to think of something that seems more more like a golem. It's really interesting. I wonder where it comes from. Thank you, Terry.
I think these figures are often ambivalent, aren't they, in terms of whether they're on your side or whether they're not, like the hero who turns up at the Battle of Marathon and blinds the person on their own side. They're seemingly on the right side, but it's not by any means clear. So then some follow-up questions from others, from Anjali. How about magic by humans to heal the land using ley lines and channeling the energy? Are the parallels in your contexts for anything along those lines?
Well, healing the land, I mean, immediately think about famine or plague, and then going to the gods in order to ask what you've done that has upset them in order to then placate them. And so I immediately don't think of anything that is like a ley line that channels energy in that sense. I suppose you might go and placate heroes. There are heroes that are a bit like, in the sense of being very local and being very powerful and able to disrupt the local landscape in ways that are destructive. That would also be another figure that you might placate. I can see that in that way. So it isn't the direct relationship in that same way. There's a sort of mediating character, but you are certainly talking to spirits and beings that are not there, and you are invoking power that you cannot see in order to heal. And the disruption is sorry. I was just going to say that disruption is if you like a supernatural disruption that expresses itself through the landscape.
It's fair to say, isn't it, Esther, that these are sorry, I was echoing back. These are things which are less are more about the kind of official formal forms of religion, less about the kind of magic end of the spectrum, if I can talk in those very, very loose terms.
Well, I don't know, because it depends. I mean, it depends if you think of magic as, rather than sort of doing the division between magic and religion, but you think of magic as the here we go, ritual practice that invokes supernatural figures and supernatural authority, i.e. invisible powers that you cannot see, then you could say that it's still in that sense magical. But I see what you're saying, Tom, that this is about the gods who are looking after your city. You go through certain perceived processes in order to get there.
Although there are questions about harvest in the Dodona tablets, aren't there? The word harvest comes up, or crops come up, animals come up.
Yes.
Plenty. So that's, if you like, in relation to individuals, just to kind of counter what I was saying. Sorry, Esther, you know more about these than me.
That's right. But again, that's about invoking some kind of unseen power, and in the sense that it is a recognizable, if you like, institutionalized unseen power, because you're going to an oracle and you're talking to a god that is well known and recognized. In that sense, it's you might classify it under the heading of religion, but with all the disclaimers that we've uttered so far throughout this entire
Perfect. Sophie, did you want to come back on
a couple of examples which actually I could have put in the talk, but I didn't, and actually they're both kind of Christian examples. I mean, one of them is an anecdote about individuals collecting sand from proximity to a monastery to be consecrated by the monks of that monastery, which they then take to the fields and scatter to. It's not so much healing the land as ensuring the fertility of their crops. And that's interesting because it does actually involve a kind of an act of consecration, if you like, by the monks who, it's collected from a particular place. Now, is that because it's convenient, because it's near the monastery where you're going to get the blessing, or is it because something to do with the proximity to a place which is thought of as having some holy status in the landscape? That's a question mark in my mind. And then an anecdote actually, which is a story about the suggestion, or the kind of mythic back reading, I suppose, that Alexander took some earth from the tomb of Jeremiah and arranged it in a circle around his city of Alexandria in order to protect it from snakes, which of course has an interesting analogue to the Patrick Island snakes nexus. So just two stories in a kind of, on very different sort of registers, because one of them is a sort of etiology, sort of back reading, and the other one is much more kind of contemporary practice. But these are both things I'm interested in, because I want to think about, how far is it that the dirt itself is powerful, and how far is it powerful only because it's been contiguous with, in this case, both powerful holy human or a powerful site. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm turning to the first of a little queue of questions we got in the chat. One of them is a kind of almost like an answer to you, Sophie, for the question you asked to Esther about nymphs, about the origin of demons instead. Not how does a nymph become a nymph, but how does a demon become a demon? From Carly. Thank you, Carly. Are demons born like demons, or do they become demons eventually? And if they do transform into demons, what were they before?
Yeah, so the quick answer to that is it depends on what particular kind of tradition and culture you're looking at, linguistic, religious and other. So the kind of Christian tradition about demons, which in itself is actually drawn from sort of apocalyptic Jewish thought, is that demons are basically fallen, so that a demon is not born as a demon, it's spawned as something else, probably an angel, and that through sin they become bad angels, i.e. demons. But that's not it's a powerful backstory, and it's one that becomes very dominant in medieval Europe as Christendom becomes the kind of dominant religious idiom. But there are plenty of other explanations, and I suppose, if you look for the kind of philosophical kind of Neoplatonic explanation of the coming to be of demons, it's much more to do with well, it actually depends on which writing you look at, but there are accounts of demons acquiring bodies as they descend from unity with the one, so from unity with the Godhead, and they acquire a kind of cloggy matter, as they descend. There are also plenty of demons that sort of have no real background or backstory, but it does seem to be the case that the demons of the magical papyri that inhabit graveyards and the like in the Egyptian papyri, some of them are related to the restless dead we've already been talking about, and many of them are just daimones. They've always been, they've always been daimons, and the question of they're not morally bad necessarily like Christian demons are. So the problem is for us is that the English word demon, like the Greek word nymph, encompasses a huge variety of things, which actually some of which are in direct competition with each other and are therefore mutually exclusive, if that makes sense. So it depends what religious and cultural tradition, I suppose, you're examining.
Esther, do you want to add anything on the incredibly amorphous category of the daimon in earlier Greek evidence?
Yes, I mean, you can use daimon to mean random supernatural being that is a god that I don't want to name, because if I name him, I've actually just said that he's done something dreadful to somebody, and if I actually said it was a particular god, then I would be punished for it, and so I'm going to use the word daimon. And that you find in the law court speeches. You find Oedipus says it, some daimon jumped on him with his fate, so it's, yes, I mean, I completely agree with Sophie. It is a very broad and lovely term, which seems to come to invoke, and if I'm just going to jump ahead to Graham de Lyons, if I pronounced your name right, Graham, sorry, point that if we say invisible beings, we could say some people cannot see, and I think that's absolutely right. Mostly in the Greek texts, when you see them, it becomes something remarkable. And so in general, it tends to be a feeling that they are there. And I think you're absolutely right that experiencing the spirits is something that you do see evidence for in these texts, and there are different ways to experience them. But I have actually just jumped ahead in order to make that point, and that's not fair. So
no, quite all right when it's connected. Should we move on to Patricia's point? Thank you, Patricia. This one I've got at the same time, unlike your earlier question, which I lost when I was kidnapped and taken away from the Zoom call. So is there a sense of formal and informal spiritualities, perhaps? That's don't know which of you would like to tackle that first.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I guess that one of the things to think about is the sort of worlds of, I mean, let's get back to worship. And since in the context that I work in, I'm, interested in Christian liturgy and the history of Christian liturgy, and you can look at the kind of world of a formal round of prayer and worship that happens in, well, it might happen in cities and churches and people join together. It might happen in monasteries where people individually are saying the daily office in their cells individually. But nonetheless, there's a kind of structured shape to that, which is knowable and in fact, in many cases, quite well recorded. But there is also a great deal of spiritual life that does not encompass. In fact, perhaps the majority of the spiritual life of Christians in late antiquity is not necessarily lived in church. It's something that animates the way that you comport yourself in public, the way you cross yourself in particular contexts, the way you think about the spaces that you inhabit and the saints that you might invoke or even pray to in all sorts of domestic and everyday contexts. So I absolutely agree that the kind of question about the distinction between them, and obviously they're also connected. So what happens in church is also something that structures the way that people live their lives and improvise. So one of the things you see, for example, in Christian clerics and monks writing amulets is that the world of liturgy shapes the language of the charms that they're writing for people who are dealing with the challenges of having sick cattle or infertile women looking for help with childbirth. So there's all sorts of interesting ways in which these worlds are in many ways separate, but that one also informs the other. And of course, the question of whether it goes the other way too, so whether or not the kind of everyday lived experience of being in a world sort of humming with invisible beings actually shapes the formal stuff. And that's, I think, harder to guess at.
Thank you. Esther, do you want to say more on this formal-informal distinction?
I think it's interesting to, because it's difficult to pin down what formal and informal mean. But there's a similar debate that goes on about private and public in our field, Tom, right? So there's there's this sense, I think, that the more formal would perhaps be the more organized in a public space, at a public level, by authority, in civic institutions in some way. But that sort of begins to break down a bit, because so much I think of that we glimpse in ancient Greek culture, to speak very broadly, is happening by individuals doing at different levels of social ritual practice. So small groups coming together to worship local heroes, groups who are on, for example, outsiders in the city who have brought their foreign god with them. Somebody else who sets up, Plato tells us about women setting up altars everywhere, and gets very upset about this. And you have this vision of people just kind of planting altars and worshipping willy-nilly. And is that informal or is it formal? Because it will all be ritualized in order that it works. So in some ways it is all formal, in that very important sense that you are communicating with a being that is in some way more powerful than you are. So you've got to watch it.
And a visual demonstration of the difficulty of distinguishing is how these temples looked on the inside, completely crammed with dedications of, God knows what, hair, coins, millions of different kinds of things. So the private, the formal informal distinction is very hard to disentangle. And then when it comes to beings, actually, the Pantalches text that you had, Esther, where other gods get into the picture as well, and he gets strength from Heracles, and he gets whatever it is from Pan, joy and happiness, and so on. There's this wonderful sense in which they're all kind of coming together, converging, different kinds of deities simultaneously. Thank you. So the next question down is Robert Gray. How does animism fit within this conversation of magic and the land, and the notion that the earth itself possesses a consciousness? Sophie, you look like you...
Yeah, look, this is sort of where I started, which is thinking about, there's a long, if one gives it kind of textual sort of cultural roots, what does it mean in the Psalms, in the Hebrew Bible, that the mountains can clap? So the notion that the earth itself as an entity is to be thought of as, and again, back to my slightly crass sort of introductory comments about Moana and Tafiti, that one is to sort of conceive of the landscape as being, in fact, an entirely connected, single organic living being. I'm not sure, I think in different places at different times you see glimmerings of this. I'm not sure that it is something... I think conceptually, the place that you might see it is particularly in the Christian worldview of the idea of the earth, the connection of the creation of earth and the creation of earth as the habitat, if you like, for first animals and then humans. And so this notion that the fate of one is tied to the fate of the other. So, for example, the Christian reading of the curse on the earth in Genesis after the Adam eats the apple and everything goes wrong is very interestingly that there's a sort of connection between the sentence of mortality that's decreed upon humans is something that is also reflected in what happens to the earth. And you find early Christian commentators talk it. I mean, actually, some months ago, Simone and I and a lovely colleague called Johannes Becker-Lindenthal did a session talking about this kind of question of, what does it mean to conceive of the earth as something that kind of acts and can suffer and indeed be punished. And it seems to me that early Christians are very alert to that, but they're not necessarily animating it by thinking about mountains being like legs or, lakes as being like eyes. It's a much more of a kind of conceptual, sort of abstract concept of mortality and aliveness, and indeed the kind of question of punishment. So I definitely think there is something there. I'm not sure I'd call it animism, because I think that probably brings a whole load of associations that are probably culturally rather separate. But definitely the notion of consciousness and aliveness and lifespan is I think very much there.
Esther, I mean, in relation to this, also there's a question at the end of the chat from Ralph Anderson about the healing of the land in a Greek context, saying, would Epimenides' purification of Athens count? Not exactly a healing of the land, but rather the community. More ecologically, sanctions and oaths might inflict barrenness on women, livestock and land.
Yes, that was the stuff that I was talking about in terms of it being you have a plague or you have a famine and you go and consult an oracle and they give you a sense of what to do next in order to placate the gods. And in some of those cases, that is to summon somebody who will come and help you purify your landscape. And in Epimenides is a mantis, well known, meant to have, I think he fell asleep in a cave for many years and then wakes up and becomes favorite and sage-like, and he comes and he enacts a ritual that will help to placate the gods. And in his particular case, I think the placating takes place by letting sheep go through the city, and where they settle, there you put an altar. But again, you've still got, it isn't in some way, it isn't ley lines in the sense that I can't remember who it was, I'm so sorry, their name, Angeli, you were talking about ley lines and channeling energy. It's not quite that. It's again, it's attempting to find out who the god is that you're meant to be placating. What do they need? Do they need a sacrifice? So again, in that same way, you've got that formalized process for helping to heal the land, in the sense of something has been done that is wrong, somebody that has offended a god, they need to be placated in some way. This is the process that we go through, and there's repeated versions of this throughout Greek texts. So I think it's very much of that sort of institutionalized process of doing it.
And you actually see it in the Roman world as well, with the kind of ding dong between pagans and Christians in the sort of 2nd and 3rd centuries, where the pagans are accusing the Christians of being responsible for all the natural disasters that are happening because you're not worshipping the gods. And the Christians can say, actually, it's your fault because you're not worshipping our God. So, you know, both parties are sort of indignant because, you know, floods and famines and plagues and, you know.
And it goes on, right? I mean, you have, if people recall the AIDS crisis being blamed by, I can't remember what the name of that policeman was, on the ways in which we had offended the divine through our behaviors. And that's, you know, so that kind of looking for somebody to blame, you know, that explanation that we have upset a divinity, a power that causes this pain. So I can see Tom making.
No, thank you both. I'm only concerned. I might leap around a little bit in the questions, so to try and get through as many of these wonderful questions as possible. I mean, you're talking about not saints falling asleep, but Epimenides falling asleep in a cave. Brings to mind kind of continuity with later contexts and sleepers of one sort. And Ronnie Gale asks whether Christians evoking saints and supernatural powers to help, is this a continuation of early magical practices? Teresa, if you're worried, I'm wanting to come to your Anthropocene question in a second, but I thought that would follow quite nicely. Sophie, do you want to respond?
Oh gosh, I mean, it's a can of worms. It's night 7:23. Yes, I mean, I'm always a bit unhappy about the category of the supernatural in late antiquity, because I think supernatural implies something that's far away and above and distant and very hard to sort of access. And it seems to me that actually this is a world in which spiritual beings of whatever kind, and indeed saints, are actually quite accessible and quite proximate, and that in a sense, with the right knowledge and with help from the right authorities, be they clerical or other, it is indeed possible to find relief from all kinds of actually really quite sort of worldly here and now concerns. So on the ground, in terms of the kind of lived experience of social and religious life in late antiquity, it seems to me that that is precisely what you see. And I refer you back to the Theo de Bruyne book on making amulets Christian. So you're seeing a Christianization, if you like, of existing practices. There is more to say on that, but that's as a placeholder, I would say, yes.
Thank you, Sophie. So another large question from Teresa. I have a desire to know how to, or if it's valuable, or slash to what, sorry, too many slashes here for me with my bad eyesight. Can we bring this information forward into the issues we're facing with the Anthropocene? Or are we keeping this convo in a historical context? Could you, yeah, could you speak, if you like, to the kind of implications of the ancient evidence for contemporary debates on the Anthropocene? But have in mind here, actually, also myself, a fantastic new book by a political scientist called Joel Alden Schlosser called Herodotus in the Anthropocene, which is, if you like, going back to antiquity to look for lessons for contemporary crisis. Do either of you have reflections on this? Again, very big question.
I Simone to unveil herself and give us the answer to this, because this is something she really works on. I would say briefly that one of the things I think that the world that I work in, the kind of late antique world, has to offer us is some quite interesting insights into thinking about a world without humans. So whether it's a world of the earth existing before the creation of humans, or indeed the world, the kind of post-disaster imagination, the apocalyptic imagination, where particular cities or particular societies are imagined as having been exploded, the humans having been killed or removed, and then the kind of wilding of those spaces. It seems to me that people in the past had a very lively understanding of what the earth looked like before us and also after us. And it doesn't necessarily help us to plan how to defend our cities from rising floodwaters, but in terms of an imaginative exercise, it seems to me that they, perhaps because living in a pre-modern society where harvests are always uncertain and you're always living on the brink of a possible extinction, that sort of sensibility is more, I don't know if that's possibly a bit overbold. What Esther might have another view on that.
I think I would go back to the question about magic and the land, and the notion that the earth itself possesses consciousness, which Robert asked. And just to come back to that, and the idea, of course, of Gaia, and the idea of the world having being alive, being full of things that we need to take care of, that we need to pay respect to, that we need to be careful around how we interact with. All of those, not literally that we need to pay them sacrifice, but as an overlaying way in which we treat our surroundings and our environment. Yes, I think there are ways in which thinking about how that interaction occurs is important. When you get down to it and you think about deforestation and you think about overgrazing and all kinds of things like this, you're not going to find the ancient world necessarily behaving any better in the actual practicalities of treating its environment. But in terms of thinking about it as an entity that deserves respect in all these different ways, yes, I think at that level, there is certainly something that we need to get hold of here.
And simply looking at the different ways in which it's envisaged. I mean, one of the lessons of the Joel Alden Schlosser book I mentioned a moment ago is simply how often rivers and landscape operate as agents in historical narratives in a way that we tend to overlook, simply because we're looking at it through a different filter. But I think that at a very banal level, that's a very important message, looking at these very, very sharply different contexts. There are a couple of very big questions that are there. So Graham's just mentioned, actually, related to that, sacrifice could include choices about products, including food and fuel.
Yes, I was literally meaning bloody sacrifice, as in cutting the throat of an animal, but Graham's is completely taken.
I'm not sure whether we've quite got time to open up all of these, but perhaps we have one last bash in the remaining 2-3 minutes. So going back in order, Graham, earlier on, I'm a bit late to the party this week and have remained silent thus far, but perhaps better to say about invisible beings that some people cannot see. My own experience is that there are 5 main ways that practitioners tend to experience spirits, of which sight is but one: visual, auditory, felt sense, kinetic, and just knowing. I know that Esther, these kind of experiential aspects are things you're very interested in, and Sophie also. Do you want to answer that question, either of you?
Yes, I mean, I put something into the chat already about the epiphanies in ancient evidence, and how, in fact, we find lots of evidence that I would actually absolutely agree with Graham about this, that there's lots of evidence in which those other beings are felt, sensed, seen. They move things around, they throw things out of temples. Plato describes Socrates feeling the divine. People feel it coming over them. They hear things, they see things. So absolutely would just agree with that. I think that's yeah, completely.
Yeah, I would agree too. And actually the visual is probably the least important. But what's also interesting is, I mean, actually the early Christian world, a lot of it's about smell. You can sense a lot about what's going on in the world around you by really paying attention to bad odors and fragrances.
Thank you both. I think bad odours and fragrances is the note on which we're probably going to end in terms of the content of this. But thank you. First of all, to all the people who've asked questions, a fantastically rich range of questions from all sorts of different perspectives. So thank you ever so much, and thank you then particularly to Esther and Sophie for for answering such a kind of dizzying array of questions in such a kind of learned and accessible way, but also just for animating these different worlds which they brought up in their presentation and in the question. So huge thanks to both of you. Don't go away, anybody, because I've got to now briefly return to my script in closing, just to say that details of future seminars and events can be found at the CRASSH website, crash with 2 s's, .cam.ac.uk, and the Magic and Ecology website, magicecology.crash.cam.ac.uk. You can also follow us on Twitter at Ecology Magic. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your questions again. And once more, thank you to our brilliant speakers. So thank you, everybody, and look forward to seeing you again in April.